Forced into marriage with a cruel man, she chose the deadly wilderness instead. What happened next proved that sometimes the most dangerous path leads to salvation. This is the story of Margaret Sullivan, whose wedding night became the first day of her real life. Margaret Sullivan stood before the cracked mirror in her childhood bedroom, watching her mother fasten the pearl buttons on a wedding dress that felt more like a burial shroud. The fabric was beautiful, ivory silk that had belonged to her grandmother, but it carried the weight of a transaction rather than the joy of a celebration. Outside her window, she could see the wedding guests gathering in the small chapel her father had built, their faces carrying the satisfaction of people witnessing a problem being solved. The problem, of course, was Margaret herself. At 23, she had remained unmarried far longer than was acceptable in their small frontier community. Her father's debts had mounted over the years, failed crops, medical bills from her mother's long illness, and the endless expenses of maintaining a homestead in unforgiving territory. When Harold Brennan had offered to pay those debts in exchange for Margaret's hand in marriage, it had seemed like the answer to everyone's prayers except her own. Harold Brennan was not a young man's 45 years, but they sat heavily on his thick frame and showed in the cruel lines around his eyes. He had buried 2 wives already, both of whom had died under circumstances that the community preferred not to discuss too closely. Margaret had seen the fear in those women's eyes during their brief marriages, the way they flinched when Harold raised his voice, the suspicious bruises that appeared and disappeared with troubling regularity. "You look beautiful, dear," her mother said, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested she knew exactly what kind of life she was sending her daughter into. "Harold is a good provider. He'll take care of you." Margaret met her mother's eyes in the mirror and saw the lie they were both trying to maintain. Harold Brennan was many things: wealthy, influential, connected to the territorial government, but he was not a good man. The women of the community spoke in whispers about his temper, about the sounds that came from his house during his previous marriages, about the way his current household staff never stayed longer than a few months. "Mother," Margaret began, but the older woman quickly looked away, her hands trembling as she arranged Margaret's veil. "Your father is waiting," her mother said firmly. "The ceremony will begin soon." Margaret's father appeared in the doorway, dressed in his best suit, but unable to hide the shame that had been eating at him for weeks. Thomas Sullivan had been a proud man once, a man who would never have considered selling his daughter to pay his debts.
But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford, and desperation had driven him to accept Harold's offer with the kind of grateful relief that made Margaret's heart break for him, even as she resented what he was doing to her. "Time to go, Maggie," he said softly, using the childhood nickname that now sounded like an apology. The walk to the chapel felt like a funeral procession. Margaret's feet moved automatically, carrying her toward a future she couldn't bear to contemplate. The guests smiled and nodded as she passed, but she could see the pity in their eyes mixed with relief that it was her fate being sealed and not that of their own daughters. Harold waited at the altar with the satisfied expression of a man who had made a successful business transaction. He was dressed in an expensive black suit that emphasized his bulk, and his small dark eyes followed Margaret's approach with the calculating gaze of someone appraising a purchase. When he smiled, she caught a glimpse of gold teeth that gleamed like warning signals in his mouth. The ceremony proceeded with dreamlike unreality. Margaret heard herself speaking the required words, felt Harold's thick fingers sliding the wedding ring onto her hand, submitted to his possessive kiss that tasted of tobacco and whiskey. Through it all, she felt as if she were watching someone else's life unfold, as if the real Margaret Sullivan had stepped outside her body and was observing this transaction with detached horror. The reception was a brief affair. Harold was not a man who enjoyed prolonged social gatherings, and soon Margaret found herself sitting beside her new husband in his wagon as they traveled toward his isolated homestead. The sun was setting behind them, and with each mile they traveled away from her family's land, Margaret felt another piece of her old self being left behind. Harold's house was larger and more prosperous than any Margaret had lived in, but it felt cold and unwelcoming despite its fine furnishings. The previous owner's touches were evident everywhere. Delicate curtains that had been chosen by feminine hands, a garden that had once been carefully tended, small decorative items that spoke of a woman's attempt to make a house into a home. But there were also signs of neglect and worse. Scratches on the wooden floors, a door that hung slightly crooked as if it had been slammed too many times, windows that had been boarded up from the inside. "This will be your home now," Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of ownership. "My previous wives found it quite comfortable." Margaret shivered at the casual way he mentioned his deceased wives, as if they had been temporary occupants rather than human beings who had lived and suffered and died within these walls. That first night established the pattern that would define their brief marriage. Harold's idea of husbandly rights was brutal and possessive, leaving Margaret bruised and terrified. He seemed to take pleasure in her fear, in the power he held over someone who had no choice but to submit to his demands.
When she wept, he told her it was her duty as a wife to accept whatever her husband required of her. The days that followed were a nightmare of isolation and abuse. Harold controlled every aspect of Margaret's life: what she wore, when she ate, where she could go within the confines of his property. He had dismissed most of the household staff, keeping only an elderly cook who was too frightened of her employer to offer Margaret any companionship or support. Margaret quickly learned to read Harold's moods, to anticipate his rages and try to avoid triggering them. But his anger seemed to have no logical source. She could be beaten for serving his coffee too hot or too cold, for speaking when he preferred silence, or for remaining quiet when he wanted conversation. The unpredictability was perhaps the worst part, because it made it impossible to feel safe, even for a moment. The house itself became a prison. Harold had locked away most of the previous wives' belongings, but sometimes Margaret would find traces of their existence: a handkerchief tucked behind a cushion, a book with pressed flowers used as bookmarks, scratches on the walls that looked suspiciously like fingernail marks. These discoveries filled her with a dread that went beyond her own suffering, because they suggested that what she was enduring was not unique, but part of a pattern that had been repeated before and would likely be repeated again. The cook, Mrs. Hartley, was a woman of perhaps 60 who had worked for Harold for only 3 months, longer than most but still relatively new. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing her duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned that invisibility was the safest strategy. When Margaret tried to engage her in conversation, Mrs. Hartley would glance nervously around as if Harold might be listening, then shake her head and hurry away. It was from Mrs. Hartley's nervous behavior that Margaret began to understand the true scope of Harold's control. The old woman was not just afraid of losing her position, she was afraid for her life. Margaret realized that Harold's reputation for cruelty extended beyond his treatment of wives to encompass anyone who might witness or question his behavior. What would you have done if you found yourself trapped in a marriage with someone who controlled every aspect of your life? Would you have tried to endure it for the sake of family honor, or would you have risked everything to escape? It was during her 3rd week as Harold's wife that Margaret made the decision that would change everything. She had been cleaning his study, one of her daily tasks, when she discovered a leather journal hidden behind a loose board in his desk. The entries, written in Harold's crude handwriting, detailed his treatment of his previous wives with the clinical detachment of someone recording the results of experiments. The first wife, Sarah, had died after what Harold described as necessary discipline for persistent disobedience. He wrote about her final days with the same tone he might use to describe breaking a stubborn horse, noting her attempts to resist, her eventual submission, and her death with what he called merciful timing. The second wife, Clara, had suffered an unfortunate accident after attempting to leave. Harold's account of her death was more detailed, describing how he had tracked her down after she fled, how he had brought her back, and how her subsequent accident had served as a lesson to the household staff about the consequences of disloyalty. But it was the recent entries that made Margaret's blood run cold. Harold had been writing about her almost daily, documenting her behavior, her attempts at defiance, her gradual submission to his control. He wrote about her as if she were a particularly interesting specimen in an ongoing experiment, noting which punishments were most effective, which fears could be exploited most successfully, which aspects of her personality might provide the most entertainment as he gradually broke her spirit. Margaret's hands shook as she read the final entry, dated just 2 days after their wedding. The new wife shows promise of being more spirited than the others. Her education and breeding suggest she will provide more interesting resistance before inevitable submission. This should prove considerably more entertaining than the previous specimens. The journal made it clear that Harold viewed his wives as property to be used and discarded at will, and that Margaret's fate would ultimately be no different from that of her predecessors. The only question was how long he would choose to keep her alive for his amusement, and how much suffering he would inflict before deciding she had outlived her usefulness. That night, as Harold slept off the effects of his evening whiskey, Margaret made her escape. She had been planning for days, hiding small amounts of food and warm clothing whenever she could do so without being noticed. She knew that her chances of survival in the wilderness were slim. It was late autumn, winter was approaching rapidly, and she had limited experience with outdoor survival. But the alternative was certain death at Harold's hands, possibly preceded by months or years of escalating abuse. Margaret slipped out of the house just after midnight, carrying nothing but a small bundle of supplies and wearing every piece of warm clothing she owned. The night was bitterly cold, with a wind that cut through her layers like a knife, but she felt a sense of freedom that made the physical discomfort bearable. For the first time in weeks, she was making her own choices about where to go and what to do. She headed north, toward the deeper wilderness where she hoped Harold would be less likely to find her. Her plan, such as it was, involved reaching a trading post she had heard mentioned in conversations, a place where trappers and hunters gathered, where she might find someone willing to help her reach a larger settlement where she could disappear into anonymity. But the wilderness was vast and unforgiving, and Margaret's city upbringing had not prepared her for the realities of survival in such harsh conditions. Within hours, she was lost, disoriented by the endless expanse of snow and trees that all looked identical in the moonlight. Her feet, inadequately protected by thin leather shoes, began to freeze, and her exposed skin burned with the cold. Dawn brought no relief, only the realization that she had wandered in circles during the night and was no closer to safety than when she had begun. The wind had picked up, driving snow into her eyes and making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Margaret's small supply of food was already running low, and she had no way to make fire or find shelter. The first day of her flight was a brutal education in the realities of wilderness survival. Margaret had romantic notions about living off the land, but she quickly discovered that finding food and water in a frozen landscape required skills and knowledge she simply didn't possess. The berries she found were either poisonous or too bitter to eat. The streams were frozen solid, and her attempts to build shelter resulted in nothing more than piles of snow and branches that provided no real protection from the wind. By the second day, hypothermia was setting in. Margaret's thoughts became sluggish and confused as she found herself stumbling more frequently. Her hands and feet had lost most of their feeling, as she was beginning to experience the dangerous drowsiness that she knew preceded death by freezing. She knew she was dying, but the knowledge came with a strange sense of peace. She had chosen her own death rather than allowing Harold to choose it for her, and that felt like a victory of sorts. It was in this state, half-conscious and resigned to her fate, that Siku found her. Margaret's first awareness of rescue came as warmth spreading through her frozen body. She opened her eyes to find herself lying near a crackling fire, wrapped in fur blankets that carried the scent of wood smoke and something wild and clean. A man knelt beside her, carefully spooning warm broth between her lips with the patience of someone accustomed to nursing injured creatures back to health. He was unlike any man Margaret had ever seen, tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. His dark hair was streaked with silver despite his apparently young age, and his eyes held the deep wisdom of someone who understood the natural world in ways that civilized people had forgotten. His clothing was made entirely from animal hides, cut and sewn with a precision that spoke of both practicality and artistry. "Drink slowly," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the soft cadence of someone who spoke another language as his first tongue.
Your body needs time to remember warmth." Margaret tried to speak, but found her throat too raw and damaged from the cold. She settled for nodding her understanding, grateful beyond words for this stranger's kindness. As warmth gradually returned to her body, she became aware that they were in some kind of shelter. Not a house, but a structure made from snow blocks and animal skins that provided surprising comfort and protection from the wind. "I am Siku," the man said as he continued feeding her small amounts of broth. "I was checking my trap lines when I found you. You were very close to the spirit world." Over the following days, as Margaret recovered from her ordeal, she learned that Siku was an Inuit hunter who lived alone in the wilderness, surviving by his skills and knowledge passed down through generations of his people. He had found her nearly buried in a snowdrift, unconscious, and minutes away from death, and had brought her to his winter shelter without asking questions about why a white woman was wandering alone in the wilderness during the onset of winter. Siku cared for Margaret with the same gentle efficiency he showed toward the injured animals he occasionally nursed back to health. He seemed to understand that she had been damaged by more than just a cold, and he made no demands on her for explanations or decisions about her future. Instead, he simply provided what she needed: warmth, food, safety, and the gift of silence that allowed her to begin healing. The shelter where Margaret found herself was a marvel of practical engineering. Siku had constructed it using traditional Inuit techniques that she had never seen before. Blocks of snow that had been cut and fitted together with mathematical precision, creating walls that were both insulating and surprisingly strong. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with sleeping areas, storage spaces, and the central fire pit that provided heat without filling the space with smoke. As Margaret's physical strength returned, she began to help with the daily tasks that survival required. Siku taught her to prepare food, to maintain the fire, to read weather signs and animal tracks. He showed her how to work with animal hides, how to repair tools and clothing, how to find medicinal plants buried beneath the snow. Each lesson was given with patience and respect, as if Margaret's questions were not interruptions, but valuable contributions to their shared understanding. But more than practical skills, Siku gave Margaret something she had never experienced before: respect for her intelligence and capabilities. He listened to her observations, valued her questions, and treated her as an equal partner in their shared survival rather than as a burden or subordinate. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt valued for who she was rather than what she could provide to someone else. The winter shelter became a sanctuary where Margaret's wounded spirit began to heal. In the evenings, Siku would tell stories of his people, tales that spoke of the deep connection between humans and the land they lived on, stories that emphasized courage, wisdom, and the importance of living in harmony with the natural world. Margaret found these stories soothing in a way that no sermon or moral instruction from her old life had ever been. "In my culture," Siku told her one evening as they watched the aurora borealis dance across the sky through a gap in their shelter, "a person's worth is not measured by who they serve or what they produce, but by their courage, their kindness, and their wisdom. You have shown all of these things." Margaret felt tears freezing on her cheeks, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. For the first time in her life, someone saw her as valuable in her own right, not as a daughter to be married off or a wife to be used. As winter deepened, Margaret and Siku developed a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. They shared the work of survival, taking turns with different tasks based on skill and preference rather than rigid gender roles. Margaret discovered that she had a talent for tracking animals and reading weather patterns, skills that Siku praised and encouraged rather than dismissing as inappropriate for women. The physical intimacy that developed between them grew slowly and naturally from their emotional connection. Unlike Harold's brutal assertions of ownership, Siku's touch was gentle and respectful, seeking Margaret's pleasure and comfort rather than simply taking what he wanted.
For the first time, Margaret understood what physical love could be when it was based on mutual care rather than domination. Margaret also began to learn Siku's language, starting with practical words related to survival and gradually expanding to more complex concepts. She found that the Inuit language had subtleties and nuances that English lacked, particularly in describing the natural world and the relationships between living things. Learning to think in this new language helped her understand herself and her place in the world in ways she had never considered before. The months passed with a rhythm that felt both timeless and purposeful. Margaret learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather, the movements of animals, the approach of seasons. She developed skills she had never imagined possessing: the ability to navigate by stars, to predict storms hours before they arrived, to find food and medicine in a landscape that had initially seemed barren and lifeless. But their peaceful existence was threatened when spring began to arrive, and with it, the possibility that Harold might renew his search for his missing wife. Margaret had told Siku something of her situation, enough for him to understand that she was fleeing from danger, but she had not revealed the full extent of Harold's cruelty or his connections to territorial law enforcement. It was Siku who first spotted the smoke from Harold's search party, visible against the clear spring sky from miles away. He recognized immediately that these were not ordinary travelers or fellow hunters, but men with a specific purpose who were searching systematically through the wilderness.
"They are looking for you," Siku said, simply, without accusation or fear, just stating a fact that needed to be addressed. Margaret felt her hard-won sense of safety crumbling. Harold had found her, or was close to finding her, and she knew that his fury at her escape would make her punishment severe beyond anything she had experienced before. Worse, she realized that her presence was now putting Siku in danger as well. "I have to leave," she said, beginning to gather her few possessions. "I won't let him hurt you because of me." But Siku placed a gentle hand on her arm, stopping her frantic preparations. "Running will not solve this," he said quietly. "A wounded animal becomes more dangerous when cornered, not less. Your husband will not stop searching until he finds you or until he is given a reason to stop." What followed was a conversation that would determine not just Margaret's fate, but the kind of life she wanted to build for herself. Siku explained that in his culture, marriage was not a league contract that bound people regardless of their wishes, but a partnership that continued only as long as both people chose to maintain it. A woman who was mistreated by her husband was not only free to leave, but was expected to do so for her own safety and dignity. Can you imagine having to choose between returning to an abusive marriage or putting someone you love in danger? How do you weigh your own safety against the risk to someone who has shown you nothing but kindness? "There is another way," Siku said carefully, "but it would require you to trust me completely, and it would mean leaving your old life behind forever." Margaret looked into his eyes that had shown her nothing but respect and care, and realized that she had already left her old life behind the moment she walked out of Harold's house. The question was not whether to abandon the past, but what kind of future she wanted to create. "Tell me," she said. Siku's plan was both simple and radical. When Harold's search party found their camp, as they inevitably would, Siku would claim Margaret as his wife according to Inuit law and custom. This would make her part of his people, subject to their laws rather than the territorial statutes that Harold used to justify his ownership of her. Harold could demand her return as his legal wife, but Siku's people recognized no such claim over a woman who had chosen to leave. The plan carried enormous risks. Harold was not a man who would accept such defiance quietly, and he had connections to law enforcement officials who might be willing to use force to reclaim what they viewed as his property. Siku could face charges of kidnapping or theft, and Margaret could be forcibly returned to a husband who would undoubtedly make her pay severely for her escape. But the alternative, spending the rest of her life running and hiding offered no real hope of freedom or happiness. Margaret realized that sometimes the greatest risk was also the only path to true safety. When Harold's party finally found their camp 2 days later, Margaret and Siku were ready.
Harold rode at the head of a group of 6 men, all armed and all carrying the grim determination of people engaged in a manhunt. His face, when he saw Margaret sitting calmly beside Siku's fire, cycled through a range of emotions: relief, fury, and something darker that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Harold," Harold said, dismounting from his horse with the heavy movements of someone who was not accustomed to extended riding. "You've caused me considerable trouble. It's time to come home." "This is my home," Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm not going back with you." Harold's face darkened with the kind of rage Margaret remembered all too well. "You're my wife, legally married in the sight of God and the territorial government. You'll come with me now, or I'll have this savage arrested for kidnapping." Siku rose to his feet with fluid grace, and Margaret was struck anew by the quiet strength he carried like a natural part of himself. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an authority that made Harold's bluster seem crude by comparison. "The woman has chosen to leave you," Siku said simply. "In the laws of my people, that makes her free. She is now my wife by her own choice, and mine." "Your people have no legal standing here," one of Harold's men interjected, his hand moving to rest on the gun at his hip. "This is territorial land, subject to territorial law." "This is land that belongs to no government," Siku replied, without moving or showing any sign of intimidation. "My people have lived here for thousands of years. We do not recognize your claim to authority over our customs." What followed was a tense standoff that could have ended in violence. Harold clearly wanted to simply take Margaret by force, but something in Siku's manner, the absolute stillness of someone completely comfortable with potential danger, made him hesitate. Margaret realized that Siku was not just a gentle healer and teacher, but also a man who had survived in one of the world's most dangerous environments through strength as well as wisdom. The impasse was finally broken by an unexpected source. One of Harold's men, an older tracker named William Carson, who Margaret recognized from her father's dealings, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Harold," Carson said quietly, "maybe we should think about this. The woman ran away on her own free will, and she's been living out here for months. Maybe she's got reasons for not wanting to come back." Harold turned on Carson with fury. "She's my wife. I paid good money for her, and I'll not be cheated by some Indian and a hysterical woman." The crude admission of having purchased Margaret like livestock hung in the cold air, making even Harold's own men uncomfortable. Carson's weathered face showed disgust at his employer's words, and Margaret could see similar expressions on several of the other faces. "Now see here, Harold," Carson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived long enough to see many ugly things and learn to recognize them for what they were. "Paying a man's debts in exchange for marrying his daughter is one thing, but buying a woman like she's livestock is another matter entirely." "It's legal," Harold insisted, but Margaret could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. He had expected to face down a helpless woman and a primitive savage, not a united front that questioned the legitimacy of his actions. Siku chose that moment to speak again, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood the politics of survival. "I know William Carson," he said, nodding toward the older man. "He is known to my people as fair in his dealings. I propose that he judge whether this woman stays or goes." Carson looked uncomfortable with the responsibility, but he also seemed to recognize that this was the only way to resolve the situation without bloodshed. He studied Margaret's face carefully, taking in the way she sat close to Siku, the health and strength she had regained, the calm determination in her eyes. "Maggie," Carson said gently, using the informal name that reminded her of her father, "are you here of your own free will? Has this man hurt you or forced you in any way?" Margaret met Carson's eyes directly, seeing in them a genuine concern that was entirely different from Harold's possessive fury. "I am here by my own choice," she said clearly. "Siku saved my life and has shown me nothing but kindness. I choose to stay with him." Carson nodded slowly, then turned to face Harold. "She's made her choice, Harold, and looking at her, I'd say it's been a good one. She looks healthier and happier than I ever saw her in town." Harold's face turned an ugly shade of red. "This is outrageous. I'll have the territorial marshal—" "The territorial marshal has better things to do than chase runaway wives through the wilderness," Carson interrupted. "Especially when those wives seem to be doing just fine where they are." The confrontation ended not with dramatic gestures or violence, but with the quiet practicality of men who had to live with the consequences of their actions. Harold's other men, seeing the way the wind was blowing, began making it clear that they had signed up for a search and rescue mission, not a kidnapping expedition. Without their support, Harold's threats carried little weight. In the end, Harold left with his tail between his legs, muttering about lawyers and legal action that everyone knew he would never pursue. The truth was that Margaret's escape had relieved him of an unwanted burden, a wife who could never be broken to his will, while allowing him to maintain his reputation as the wronged party. Carson lingered after the others had left, accepting Siku's offer of coffee and speaking quietly with both Margaret and her new husband. Before he departed, he offered Margaret a piece of advice that would prove invaluable in the months to come. "If anyone asks about you in town, I'll tell them you died in the wilderness. That'll put an end to any gossip and let you live in peace."
As far as I'm concerned, Margaret Brennan died out there in the snow, and whoever you are now is someone entirely different. The symbolic death of her old identity felt like a gift beyond price. Margaret Sullivan, the frightened girl who had been sold into marriage, no longer existed. In her place was a woman who had chosen her own life, her own love, and her own future. The years that followed brought challenges and joys that Margaret could never have imagined during her brief, miserable marriage to Harold. She and Siku built a life together that honored both of their cultures, incorporating the practical wisdom of Inuit traditions with elements of her own background that brought value to their partnership. Their first winter together as a truly married couple tested every skill they had developed. The cold was more brutal than anything Margaret had experienced during her rescue winter, and food was scarcer due to changes in animal migration patterns. But Margaret found that hardship shared with someone who valued her contributions felt entirely different from hardship endured alone or with someone who blamed her for every difficulty. Margaret learned to hunt and trap alongside Siku, becoming skilled enough to contribute significantly to their survival. But she also brought her own knowledge, literacy, basic medical training from her mother, skills in textile work and food preservation that complemented and enhanced the traditional methods Siku taught her. Their children, when they came, grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Inuit traditions and the broader world that Margaret's background opened to them. They learned to respect the land and its creatures from their father, while gaining from their mother the tools they would need to navigate an increasingly complex world where native peoples and settlers would have to find ways to coexist. The trading post that Margaret had originally hoped to reach became a regular stop in their seasonal migrations. She and Siku became known there as reliable partners who could guide travelers through dangerous territory and who understood both cultures well enough to serve as interpreters and mediators when conflicts arose. Margaret developed a quiet network to help other women escape abusive situations, using her unique position to guide them towards safety and new lives. She became known among certain circles as someone who could help arrange disappearances when legal remedies were inadequate or unavailable. These activities carried significant risks, but Margaret had learned that some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was allowing injustice to continue unchallenged. As she aged, Margaret often reflected on the choice that had changed everything. The terrified girl who had stumbled into the wilderness, thinking she was choosing death, had actually been choosing life. Real life, authentic life, life lived on her own terms rather than as someone else's possession.
Harold Brennan had died years earlier, found frozen to death in his own barn after apparently falling and striking his head during one of his drunken rages. Margaret felt no satisfaction at his death, only a quiet sense of closure and relief that he could never hurt anyone else. The trading post had grown into a small town, complete with institutions that Margaret had helped create. A church that welcomed all cultures, a school that taught in multiple languages, a medical clinic that combined traditional and modern healing methods. Margaret served on various committees and boards, her judgment trusted by people from many different backgrounds. Her greatest pride remained her family. Their children had become respected leaders who could navigate both traditional and modern worlds with equal skill and confidence. They served as bridges between communities, helping to resolve conflicts through understanding rather than force. Margaret's story had become part of the community's oral tradition, not as a simple rescue tale, but as proof that people possessed far more strength and adaptability than conventional wisdom suggested. Her example had inspired other women to take risks in pursuit of freedom, and her network had helped dozens of them escape situations that would have destroyed them. In quiet moments by the fire, watching her grown children with their own families, Margaret would remember the wedding dress that had felt like a burial shroud. That girl had thought she was being buried, but she had actually been reborn. The wilderness that had seemed like certain death had become the place where she found her true self. The woman who had once been forced into marriage with a cruel man had found her salvation in the dangerous wilderness, exactly as the story had promised from its very beginning. Margaret had learned that salvation was not something that happened to people, but something that people created for themselves through courage, determination, and the willingness to imagine possibilities that others dismissed as impossible. Forced into marriage with a cruel man, she had chosen the deadly wilderness instead, and what happened next had proved that sometimes the most dangerous path leads to salvation. Margaret's journey had shown that the greatest risk was often the only path to true freedom, and that love found in the most unlikely places could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities.